Okay, so today's lesson is about World War II, and more specifically about Japan's invasion of the two areas that we've been studying in Southeast Asia, which are Vietnam and Cambodia. So in this lesson, we'll look at a bit of a background, how Japan came to invade this area, the impact the Japanese invasion had on these two areas, and its role in promoting nationalism among the people of Vietnam and Cambodia. Alright, so a bit of background to this. As you'll remember, the French held colonies in Southeast Asia at the outbreak of World War II. They were called French Indochina. They included what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Japan had been expanding in territory before the outbreak of the war in Europe. They had moved into Manchuria and started to invade large areas of China down the coast here. When World War II broke out in Europe, the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, quickly invaded France. This was in 1939. And once France surrendered and fell to Nazi Germany, and it wasn't difficult at all for Japan to invade and claim these regions. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, when they began the invasion effort in earnest, they controlled all major cities and populated regions in Southeast Asia, and they had taken key lands and key areas away from European colonizers, such as the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the French. In the lead up to this, as Japanese forces spread across Southeast Asia, you saw a massive exodus of European and American civilians. They took the first plane, boat, or train out of Southeast Asia in order to escape the oncoming Japanese advance. Of course, the people living in Southeast Asia saw this and naturally freaked out. It was a sign that they were fleeing in the face of peril, and it was also seen as quite a betrayal. The ultimate effect of the Japanese success and rapidity in invading Southeast Asia was it really damaged Western pride and prestige, especially in the eyes of Southeast Asian people who saw this whole image, this mystique of the Western colonial empires and their strength being shattered really, really quickly by the Japanese forces. So how did the Japanese sell their invasion of these areas to the people who live there? Well, they didn't admit their true reason for invading these areas, which was to acquire key resources. Instead, they used propaganda, particularly this neat little idea, which they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Basically, what this meant was Japan was liberating Southeast Asia and the people who lived there from the evil Western forces who had colonized them. And together, Southeast Asians would fall into this economic sphere led by Japan. One of the main slogans for this was Asia for the Asians. So it was liberating and freeing people, not invading and conquering them. However, people pretty soon realized that this whole thing was a bit of a sham. Japanese invading forces were imperialist, just like the European ones who had come before. And they might hide behind this idea of Asia for Asians or Southeast Asian nations for Southeast Asian people. But really, they had their own racist ideas as well. They saw themselves as the master race of Asia as a whole. And they viewed people in these countries in Southeast Asia to be racially inferior to Japanese people. So the idea that they saw Southeast Asians as equal, that they had their interests at heart, was shown very quickly to not be true. Even so, despite the fact that the Japanese forces didn't really have the interests of Southeast Asians deeply at heart, they still did promote nationalism and nationalist ideas in Southeast Asia. And the reason for that was they used nationalism to legitimize their invasion, that they were taking back Asian areas for Asian people, and to get support from the public who these ideas were really popular with. One of the first steps of promoting nationalism and getting people in Southeast Asia to move away from European influences was to release nationalist leaders in Southeast Asia who had been imprisoned. So all of those were suddenly free or were able to return from exile, where the Europeans had sent them, to spread their ideas. And these nationalists were really able to recruit huge support among the populace. They had access to radio, they had access to newspapers, they were no longer being censored by the Europeans, so they could start promoting ideas like a Vietnam for Vietnamese people. An important thing that the Japanese also did was that they mobilized young people, much like the Nazis did with Hitler Youth. And this was a pretty big inversion in Southeast Asia because the age dynamics in that region were that older people led younger people, and younger people had to follow what older and wiser people had told them to do. They were to follow, not to lead. But the establishment of youth organisations kind of inverted this trend. It made them take on an active role in leadership, and later a lot of key figures in these youth organisations started by the Japanese were the ones who were attracted to nationalist movements, and often they became leaders in these nationalist movements. Now, as I said before, the reality was that the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a sham. Japan had taken these areas because they were mostly interested in the resources, the oil, the tin, the rubber, the rice, and a secondary interest of theirs was that they wanted to control the Pacific. They wanted to control the area around their nation to prevent their enemies, and the US particularly, from encroaching too much on the mainland of Japan. They also wanted to build a glorious empire, like what Europeans had in the decades before. And it also should be acknowledged that very few Japanese people knew much or cared much about the Southeast Asian cultures in places like Cambodia and Vietnam. For the most part, the personnel who were sent to places like Vietnam and Cambodia were generally quite arrogant, and they had a superiority which matched that of European people. They saw cultures and people who they regarded as inferior to themselves. There were a few exceptions. Some commanders were sympathetic to the local population and their experiences, but this is the exception rather than the rule. And the hope that a lot of Southeast Asian people had that the Japanese would be an improvement compared to the previous European colonizers was quickly dispelled, and later on the war absolutely crushed. Now, I'm not going to say that there weren't any advantages for the populations, but on the whole, in most cases, the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia imposed more severe conditions than colonization under the Europeans had. This was particularly the case in the later years of the war. But even from the beginning, Japanese occupation imposed a really great deal of economic and physical hardship. To start off with, it destroyed links to the world economy. There were shortages of resources which had previously been imported from Europe, specifically medicine and things like that. The Western companies that had previously been open in Vietnam and Cambodia had closed with the exodus of European civilians, and this resulted in mass unemployment among the people, which meant it was harder for them to feed themselves. And particularly in the last year or two of the war, Japanese forces actually plundered the land and seized a lot of natural resources and food. In 1945, whilst Vietnam was experiencing a famine, for example, Japan continued to take the best food supplies, including rice, and export it back home to feed Japanese people, which just worsened conditions and resulted in a lot of misery. There were some impacts that were seen as positive then and later on. One of these is the fact that the Japanese forces purged Western influences. They got rid of things that had been introduced by the Europeans. So, for example, they suppressed Christianity, they closed some churches, they prevented conversions. They also closed European schools, and they encouraged a return to native religions, such as Buddhism. So what was the treatment of native populations like in these areas? Well, we'll start off by looking at the negatives. Sometimes these could be labelled as atrocities or war crimes. One of the most famous examples of Japanese treatment of civilians in Southeast Asia relates to the Thai-Burma Railway. Basically, Japanese forces started up massive infrastructure projects like building a railway which joined Thailand to Burma. And instead of conscripting work, they instead drafted slave labourers, so they took slaves by force, to build these roads and bridges. The conditions were awful. The workers were very poorly treated, the slaves, I should say. Many sickened, were malnourished, and a lot died from how harsh the conditions were. Very few returned. One survivor of the Thai-Burma Railway project said, "People died or lived just like pebbles that caught in a sieve, and I was like a grain of sand that escaped." Another famous incident of atrocities committed relates to comfort women. These women were called comfort women because they were meant to provide comfort to Japanese troops. Another term that could be used could be sex slaves. A lot of these women were from areas of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and Cambodia. Some came from China and Korea. Some of them were bribed or coerced, and many of them were simply forced to work in brothels serving Japanese soldiers. An important point to note as well is as the war worsened and conditions got worse for Japanese people, the brutality in Southeast Asia also correspondingly increased. If we're looking at some of the positives, however, of the treatment or the impacts for people in this area, the main impact was psychological. For many, it cut ties with European people, and as I said before, it demonstrated that European people were not invincible, that colonialism was a state that did not have to exist forever. Secondly, because there weren't enough Japanese to effectively administer such a wide area, a lot of Southeast Asians were actually given positions of relative power and knowledge. They were promoted to administrative positions, roles in the government, that had previously only been given to Westerners. So it gave some people in Southeast Asia an experience in minor levels of government and managing affairs. And the final point is, Japanese repression of Western culture, like I talked about before, things like religion and schools, actually resulted in many cases in a return of native culture, writing in the original script of the Khmer, for example, in Cambodia.